Hello,
Yeah.
everyone. And today we're going to talk about the outlook for the Trinidad and Tobago economy for 2020 into 2021. This is a big year for Trinidad and Tobago. We're going to have an election, say, in the last quarter of this year. And so I have three very esteemed and well recognized gentlemen with me today to talk about various aspects of the Trinidad and Tobago economy. I will let them introduce themselves in alphabetical order according to your surname. So let's see if they get this right. Take it away,
Okay.
guys.
All right. I am Mariano Browne. I am the former Minister of Trade, former Minister in the Ministry of Finance, and I currently operate as a consultant.
Thank you.
Okay, Raja Hosein, Senior Lecturer and Economist at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine. And I teach international trade and Caribbean economic development at the graduate level.
Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. Kevin Ramnarine, former Minister of Energy, Trinidad and Tobago. Currently a consultant focusing on the energy sector in Trinidad, Guyana, and Suriname. And I also lecture at the Lockjack Business School in the MBA in Sustainable Energy Management.
Thank you. So, to kick things off, we have a few topics that we want to cover. And the way we'll do this is that everybody has a couple of topics they would like to discuss. And I would like each of you to feel free to jump in as we each go around and each of us handles the two topics that we wanted to cover. I will go last. I will give the three of you, my guests, to go first. Mariano, let's start with you as we're going in alpha order. Given the roles that you have played in government in Trinidad and Tobago, tell us what your thoughts are, please, on the current fiscal policy stance and where that has gotten us in terms of the debt load, not just from this administration, but previous administrations as well. What are your thoughts on, do you agree with the fiscal policy stance? Do you not agree? What would be your policy recommendations going forward?
Well, the critical issues are from a fiscal position. The government has found itself in a situation where it's had to reduce its expenditure because its revenue has been reduced. And as a result of that, it has been borrowing on a continuous basis, starting with the CLICO crisis, borrowing to finance that in particular. But then again, borrowing on a continuous basis to finance the shortfall in the revenue. So we've been financing our recurrent expenditure as well, in some instances, financing our debt payments as well.
Exactly.
So between 2010 and now, our debt to GDP ratio has gone up from approximately 29% of GDP to about 62. Last checking in terms of the last budget speech. Probably has increased a little bit more since then. On the other side, of that 29%, approximately only 8% was due to external parties, in other words, foreign debt. That figure has changed substantially. So that whereas before in 2010, and maybe even up to 2012, 2013, we would have been able to pay off our foreign debt comfortably from our existing resources. Now we're in a slightly different position, which is much worse. And also to our balance of payments position, our surplus has been declining. Between 2014 and November 2019, the net reserves are down by approximately $4 billion US. And we've moved from 11 to 12 months of import cover to about 8 months of import cover. So if you put the two things together and you look at it from the fiscal perspective, in a sense, the fiscal position has been an attempt to slow down the loss in foreign exchange, as well as to manage existing resources. But one of the mistakes or one of the missing features is that our sense of priorities. What are we placing priority on? So that we've found in large measure that a substantial portion of the current budget is for what we consider to be subsidies and transfers. Now that is a sort of an omnibus number. It includes transfers to state enterprises, as well as transfers to what one would consider to be social expenditures. It grew, unfortunately, between 2010 and 2015 from approximately 38, 39% of government revenues, of government expenses, yes, to approximately 50% at today's date. That increase is about, was at that time $16 billion. And now we're trying to cut it down. So we're trying to move from approximately $30 billion in subsidies and transfers. It's come down somewhat, about 25, but there's still a lot of room there. Now, that's one of the biggest areas in which the government finds itself in terms of the difficulties in terms of finding itself. What are the priorities inside of that area? What does government need to do? What stop doing, and what government will pass on to the private sector? And more importantly, what does the citizenry have to pay for or increase its payments towards? Now, there's some specific instances.
Mario, I just want to stop you and ask you, please, about the fact that, yes, we have seen, based on reductions in revenue, some reduction in expenditure, say in 2015, 2016, 2017. But in the last two budgets, we saw increases in expenditure, notwithstanding significant deficits. Yes, not as significant as 2015 and 16, but still significant deficits. I am personally of the view that the government should not have been increasing the deficit last fiscal year and then current fiscal year, which ends in September of this year. Especially given the debt load which you highlight. Now, I must say that you highlighted statistics on net debt to GDP, whereas if you look at the gross figure, which is debt that we still pay interest on, it's over 80%. Okay.
Yes.
So, and we have a primary fiscal deficit, which means we're paying interest on existing debt. Sorry, we're borrowing to pay interest on existing debt. So we have to look at the gross figure for these purposes to assess creditworthiness. What is your opinion on the fact that we've had 2 consecutive years, including this year, of increases in expenditure and therefore the deficit?
Well, my position on this is that we ought to have been managing the expenditure position much more tightly. That, of course, requires some political will. And it also requires that we explain to the public exactly what our priorities are. So the point that you're making with regard to the gross and the net debt has to do, of course, with what we consider to be our tap bonds. The fact that we've been sterilizing money at a cost to ourselves. And I have to say, I was part of that architecture in 2009, where we decided that we would actually start taking money out of the system. Again, it was a defensive measure. It was attempted to defend the foreign exchange rate. Because if we have left it in position, what we would have found is that we'd have found inflation would have happened, and generally speaking, things would have gotten out of hand. So the idea was to tidy that. I take the point that you're making with regard to the tender position, and that the tender bills effectively do add to the burden, to the debt burden from that perspective, especially that you are in a fiscal difficulty. So you have to balance some priorities here. And here's the issue, all right? And this is the point I think that is missing. One, there's a hole in the fiscal revenue position. That's the first point. And that hole, in large measure, some of that $25 billion is being spent in subsidies. We still have approximately $1 billion in subsidies largely on the diesel side. We have about $2.5 billion in subsidies with respect to WASA. And we also have annual subsidy, and Kevin can correct me if I'm wrong on this, with regard to T&T. Effectively, there's a hole there. There's an implicit subsidy as well. That could be anywhere between 700 to 800, 700 to a year. Right? So just between those 4 items, you're talking about $5 billion, which technically should be out of the system. Now you have to make up your mind. Are we going to defend the foreign exchange variable, which is what the tender bills, the TAP bills are intended to do? Or alternatively, are we going to continue to subsidize on the other side of the fence? The government has attempted to do both. My position is very simply that we have to find a way to live within our revenue position. And our revenue position is a maintainable revenue position, I think somewhere between 42 and $45 billion. And I think that's where we have to, that's the goal that we have to aim for. So if you're spending 51 or 52, then you're between $5, $6, $7 billion outside. And that's where your deficit is coming from. You can't do the two things. So you have to determine how much of one thing you can do at the other one. Now, given that there's a political variable with regard to some of the subsidies, then by definition, you've got to do it progressively. You can't do it all at once. But you must have an intent to do so.
Which they did this with the gasoline subsidy, and it worked pretty well, right? So
correct.
there's a model there that we can follow. But
precisely.
Yeah, I just actually wanted to ask both Roger and Kevin if, for their thoughts on this issue. And I completely agree with you, Mariano, that we need to be looking to have an intention to live within our means.
So let me go first, Kevin. I looked this morning, I spent some time calculating the underemployment rate in Trinidad and Tobago. We all know that the unemployment rate is 3.8%, but that number keeps baffling me and surprising me. So in the last 2 weeks, I had someone pull together all the data for me on employment in terms of number of hours worked by sector. And I calculated this morning the underemployment rate for Trinidad and Tobago, and it stands at 8% using 2016 data. That's the most available data. So if we add that 8% on to 3.8, let's call 3.84%, which it would possibly rise to when 2019 data comes out, we are somewhere close to 12% unemployment, 12% unemployment in Trinidad and Tobago when we include underemployment and the unemployed times the number of hours worked. And I raise that in the context of the transfers and subsidies because CPEP is something that you all know greatly concerns me. And when we look at the underemployment rate in CPEP, it is by far the highest in all the sectors I examined. And the employment level in community service and community social and personal services is going up, and the underemployment rate is also high. And so the state has to get serious. We are talking about running a tight fiscal scenario. Or how can you, in the context of a
when we're subsidizing the labor market? So in addition, as Mariano identified, in addition to WASA, in addition to T&T, we're also subsidizing the wage rate, basically.
And also, it involves what I call a abnormal cost disease effect, in the sense that the slowest part of the economy is growing the fastest in terms of employment. So if one were to take 1999 and 2018 data, the largest increase in employment took place in community, social, and personal services sector, and that has the lowest level of labor productivity. So you are increasing the size of the part of the economy with the lowest contribution to labor productivity, and it has a drag, therefore, on overall GDP growth. And this is pretty basic economics. I know the Minister of Finance often refers to very basic economics. So this is very basic economics that I'm sure all the parliamentarians understand, and therefore it troubles me that even though we understand it, we continue to focus heavily on these sectors. And moving or using that as a stepping stone, these things obviously filter into a wide cadre of statistics of national importance. If you look at the unemployment rate of 3.8%, that would go down as ranking as one of the best in the world. But look at our labor force participation rate. It has been worsening. So we have moved from about 63% in 2004, we are down to 58.7%. So what has been happening is people is leaving the labor force. You have the non-institutionalized population and you have the labor force. And if you
why
take the labor,
why are they leaving the labor force? What do you think explains that?
That's the million-dollar question. Now, my guess would be they are forming gangs and they are joining gangs and they are doing informal sector activity. I have no proof at this point in time, except there's a high correlation between the out of the labor force element of the non-institutionalized population and the homicide level in Trinidad and Tobago. The correlation is in the 90s. So that is where I think crime now has an economic dimension, in the sense that if we get the labor market correct, we reduce the probability from a correlation perspective of such a high murder level. I hope that makes sense.
I hear you. I just would like to say, though, that if people are moving away from, as you mentioned, the informal sector, um, I would imagine when the CSO is taking this statistic, because the labor force participation rate looks at those who are employed as well as those who are unemployed. Whether you're employed formally or informally, do they make a distinction? So, for example, if you are a PH driver.
So they would only look at those that they can formally record.
Okay.
So those who are classified as not in the labor force. So remember, the labor force has two classes: employed and unemployed, and factor that into the labor force. But those who are not part of the labor force, in other words, those who are not willing and able to work at the existing wage rate, will not be classified as part of the labor force. And the non-institutionalized population minus the labor force gives you the out of the labor force group. And that has gone up considerably in Trinidad and Tobago. And it's where I think a lot of mischief happens.
Well,
and
mischief, but also that's where the informal sector also has been growing. But let's stop 1 second here on, because I feel like we could talk for an hour on this. And let's hear Kevin a little bit and shift gears a little bit, because of course the energy sector has always been dominant in Trinidad and Tobago, even though I think it really ought not to be anymore. Kevin, tell us a little bit about what your thoughts are in terms of prices and production this year. But also, I want to ask, and not just ask you, but even Roger and Mariano as well. Why is it when we read a budget, we still quote in an oil price as a peg for a benchmark, sorry, for revenue, when we have been a net oil importer for I don't know how long, certainly more than 10 years. But let's leave that for a little bit. That's just a point I want to raise. Kevin, let's hear what you have to tell us.
Okay, the first thing which I think is of concern and hasn't been getting much publicity is the price situation for all the commodities we export. So I'll just give you an idea of what happened between 2018 and 2019. For West Texas Intermediate crude oil, we had a 12.8% drop. That's 2018 versus 2019. For Brent North Sea oil, minus 10.2 drop. For the Henry Hub price, this is comparing November 2018 to November 2019. We had a 34.7% drop. For the European price, for natural gas, we had a 38.9% drop. For the East Asian price, we had a 44.6% drop. For ammonia prices, we had a 23.4% drop. And for methanol prices, we had a 37.7% drop. Wow. So those are prices that are very important to us because we export crude oil, we export natural gas, we export ammonia, and we export methanol. So the prices are all down, and the forecast for 2020 is available for some of these commodities, and the forecast is not available. I don't have the data for all, but all the forecast information that we have shows that those 2019 numbers would persist into 2020. So what we have is this is going to impact the revenue of the ammonia plants in Point Lisas because their prices are down. The methanol plants, their prices are significantly down. It's going to affect our revenue from LNG because natural gas prices are down. And of course, Trinidad, we export crude oil. All the oil that we produce now is exported, even though that's a pretty low number. We export that oil, so we get less revenue for that oil because prices are down. In terms of, so that's the price scenario, Marla.
Could I just
give you the numbers.
and ask you one question though on that, Kevin? Because in the past, when the refinery would have been up and running, we would have had some local production of crude. We would have imported a whole lot more crude, and we would have refined and we would have exported refined product. Is it that the export earnings now that we are no longer refining, are those export earnings lower than if we were when we were refining when we were exporting refined product? How does it
Well,
compare?
well, I don't have the numbers, like I don't have the financials for Paria and Heritage and so on to make uh, a comment on that. But what I will say is that we import about 25,000 barrels of refined product, and that's to keep the country running. So that's your gasoline, your diesel, your jet fuel, and so on. And Heritage Petroleum exports about, I think they export about maybe about 37,000 barrels per day. So what we know is that Paria fuel trading has had a US dollar problem. And
Right.
this is public information because the Minister of Finance said so.
Mhm.
In one of his press conferences last year, he said he had to find, is it $20 million US per month, somewhere in that region to give to Paria to
In
keep the
other words,
operations going.
Petrotrin was a net user of foreign exchange, right?
Well, I heard that being said by Mr. Espini, and I also heard a different, opposite point of view from former Petrotrin chairman and former Petrotrin president. So I don't know for sure, but what I do know is that Paria is buying product on the international market, of course, with US dollars, and they're selling about two-thirds of that into to they're selling about two-thirds of that to NP and Unipet, and they sell it at TT dollars, and they export the remainder. So they are net user of US dollars. Um,
Hmm.
Heritage Petroleum is not earning the amount of US dollars that I think the government anticipated it would have earned because one, production has fallen significantly.
Mhm.
And two, as I just pointed out, their prices have come down. So that is why the Minister of Finance said in that press conference last year, November, that he had to find US dollars, and I believe the figure was 20 million US dollars per month to give to
Hmm.
Paria to import fuel. So we have a US dollar cash flow problem there. Um,
Yes.
so that's the price scenario. The prices have all trended down significantly in 2019, and the forecast is for it to stay at that level or slightly lower in 2020.
Hmm.
And of course, the reason for all this is there's oversupply of almost everything that I just called out there: ammonia,
Right.
methanol, natural gas, oil. They're just a glut everywhere in the world for these commodities.
Right. Well, you know, that point you made about the lower foreign exchange inflows dovetails nicely into, and Mariano touched on it, into the fact that we've had reserves that have been declining. I mean, have you all seen that chart? It's almost linear, almost a straight line. It's remarkable how steady that decline in the level of foreign exchange reserves looks on a chart. And we're at about just around 7 billion US dollars right now,
Six
which
point
is 6.8. Thank
yeah,
you.
November 2019.
Thank you. And this is just about what, 7 months of import cover, right? Now, one of the things I want to talk about with respect to that is, as we had discussed, as you had mentioned, Mariano, that that level of reserves is preserved by two things. One, the level of injections that the central bank chooses to give to the market, but also it has to do with the fiscal stance, because the more expansionary your fiscal stance is, the bigger your fiscal deficit, the more you're spending, basically, it drives an outflow of foreign currency
Mm.
because of how heavily import dependent we are. Now,
Mm.
it's remarkable to me that looking at the debt load, looking at the size of the deficit, looking at the way that reserves have been declining, that the government would continue to expand the fiscal deficit and to the extent of 34% increase this fiscal year. Now, one of the things I wanted to ask you guys if you had a view on this, but I have seen in Jamaica, in Suriname, in Barbados as well. Once you start to get to around 3 months of import cover, which we're not far away from, you start to notice that this pace of decline accelerates. right? So we might see that line becoming a little steeper because there is panic and people try to get out of local currency and into foreign currency. What is your view on what the outlook for reserves would look like? And therefore, what is your view on what is the end game? Where do we end up in a balance of payment crisis, if at all? My own view is that we can, at the, if the policy stance continues as is, the fiscal policy and the foreign exchange policy stance of having an overvalued currency by, depending on which measure you look at, up to 40% overvalued. If you look at the black market rate, it's anywhere between 750 and 8. And that, of course, is not sustainable. I have a view that we can be in a balance of payments crisis by next year or 2022, if we're lucky. What is your view, each of you, on that?
Well, I'll start first since I was speaking about the issue. And in the 5 years, the numbers have varied, although they've more or less, in the last 2 years, they're kind of close. So, for example, in the 2015, January to December, reserves fell by 1.6 billion. It was the biggest loss. It mitigated a bit in 2016, 468 million. Went back up in 2017, $1 billion, 1.1 billion. In 2018, 739, and so far for 2019, of course, the data is only to November, and December tends to be an outflow. It's at 642. So you can say we comfortably will be $700 million again, minus $700 million again this year.
Yeah.
Well, the answer is, if you keep doing the same thing, you're not likely to get a different result.
Right.
Okay, so that as long as we keep the fiscal position as it stands, we can expect a net outflow again next year. Now, those numbers don't take into consideration, or at least don't expressly take into consideration, the fact that we've been borrowing in US dollars. And if you take the fact that we've been borrowing in US dollars and they just generally go into the reserves, right? The net outflow the actual outflow is larger.
Of course.
Significant. Right, so that's your point with regard to, and I think Terence Farrell makes this point all the time in terms of his experience in the central bank between 1983 and 1986, that essentially it gets to that crisis point, the 90-day limit, and then it all of a sudden evaporates.
Yeah.
So that the defensive measures, you have to start taking the defensive measures now. That's one of the reasons why I said priorities. All right, and that's one of the reasons why I take your point with regard to the gross national debt, the fact that we have tap bonds. In fact, we're trying to isolate money so that it doesn't get into the monetary system and therefore fuel loan demand, which effectively will spike your surge in your foreign exchange outflow. So I accept that point, but you can't do both. And I think that's the point. The point is making the decision whether we start basically, for example, if you look at transfers and subsidies, you'll see subsidies as being very small because the real subsidies are being hidden in the transfer sector. Yes, in the transfer for state enterprises.
Sorry, yeah.
Right? Yes. So that's hiding it. Right. So you're really talking about expenditure cuts and passing on those if you want, those costs to the public, John Q. public. Now, that in a sense will remove some of the surplus demand.
But what are your thoughts around, do you see the policy stance shifting meaningfully, and what is your outlook with respect to the balance, to the reserves, and do you see a balance of payments crisis on the cards in the next couple of years, or do you think it's something that we can avoid?
I think no, I don't. I mean, the only way that you could avoid that is if energy prices go up. That's the only way that you could avoid that. And even then, if the energy prices go up, that's only for a time. So that's temporary. The longer term fix.
You're not avoiding it.
No, correct. You're just delaying it. You're not avoiding it. But from a political perspective, that's what politicians do. They delay. They don't avoid. Right. So that in this particular circumstances, I think we have to make there deeper decisions that have to be made that we've been avoiding. All right. And I think that's critical. I think that's an important point. So I think we've postponed the adjustment process. Right. The adjustment process, which ought to have started in 2015. In fact, it ought to have started in 2014,
14,
right?
14,
As
right.
soon as the crisis hit, we needed to start it immediately, right? We've postponed it for 6 years. I think as the longer you postpone it, like it's like taking medicine. If you are sick, delay taking your medicine, by the time you get to take the medicine, you have to take it in higher doses. And that is the difficulty, that is what creates the political problem. That's why I make the point on an ongoing basis that leadership is important. Leadership is about communication. Leadership is about identifying priorities. Leadership is about building buy-in, and so on and so forth. We haven't done that. So
but that
my
kind of
position,
leadership is largely absent, unfortunately, in my own view. But
it's
anyway,
true. It is what you want, but it is what is required. It may
it is.
be absent, but that's what the country needs.
I
Right?
agree with you.
And so I
Thanks.
make the point, we are delaying, right? We're not avoiding. And I don't
Roger,
think
what
we
is?
cannot avoid it forever.
I agree. Roger, what is your sense of all of this in terms of reserves and balance of payments?
Well, it's interesting to hear Mariano's views in that you all mentioned the real effective exchange rate, and we at the university, we have been calling on the government across different administrations to let us fix this real effective exchange rate. But the problem has now become compounded in the sense that not only is the real effective exchange rate overvalued, you could probably live with that in some form or the fashion, but trading across borders has now become extremely difficult in terms of its ranking. So you have a double whammy blow to non-energy exports. And whilst we focus
because
a lot
the non-energy exports have been rendered uncompetitive based on an overvalued currency, partly.
Right, but the other part of it is if you have an efficient trading across border regime, that can help to counter some of the inefficiencies brought on stream by an appreciated real effective exchange rate. What we have is the two now moving in the same direction so that non-energy exports are really being dealt some severe blows in the Trinidad Tobago economy. And we keep saying to policymakers, fix the non-energy export part of the economy. Do not let the ease of doing business index slide. Boom. Ease of doing business index has moved from 66 in 2014 down to 105 now in 2020. So we are really in a catastrophic state in that regard. And you hear a lot of loud talking, a lot of desk thumping with regards to the ease of doing business index. Personally, I think some form of KPI should be set where if you are the line minister and you don't get within a 3-year period a 25-point improvement in the ease of doing business ranking, you should resign. I think we have to move to that level of governance in Trinidad and Tobago across all the sectors. I mean, I looked at the Vision 2030 document, for example, and it's so far away, Marla, from the realities of the budgets that are supposed to be the data points between 2015 to 2030 that give you the 2030 vision over the medium to long-term period. They are like outliers.
Between current policy and Vision 2030, there's a huge disconnect.
Yes, it's just crazy. And what we have tried is an internal evaluation. So what I did is I used relative purchasing power parity, and I looked at the exchange rate that would bring the nominal exchange rate in sync with the change in our domestic price level since 2000 and in sync with the American price level since 2000. And you are seeing huge numbers that I am afraid to mention here in terms of causing panic, but it is significantly more than the 6.7 we see now. What I would say is if we continue to use the internal devaluation, which is Mariano's pet term, of cutting government expenditure as a strategy to improve external competitiveness, it will take us until 2085. But Keynes clearly said in the long run, we are all dead. So I don't know if the Minister of Finance or the Minister of Planning or which government authority is trying to balance the real effective exchange rate using the internal devaluation and thinking about 2085. That strategy is totally wrong. And maybe the advisors need to look at that some more. But specifically with regards to your current account balance situation, we have a reasonably low-hanging fruit in terms of the low-hanging, in terms of the ease of doing business index. It's bad, so it's relatively easy to fix. And we should probably look at Jamaica, Rwanda, or Mauritius to get some examples of some of the type of interventions they made in the last 5 years to improve their ease of doing business ranking. And we try to adopt and innovate where we could on those type of changes. But one thing is clear, Marla, business has to now be unusual. It cannot be business as usual.
I agree, but I just want to go back to your comment on internal devaluation. I am not so sure that that was explicitly the policy agenda of this administration, because they had a revenue shortfall that they needed to grapple with. And if you are indeed embarking on an internal devaluation, like Barbados did in, say, 2013, 14, somewhere around there, it is something you have to articulate, and it is something that you have to have as a policy agenda throughout: fiscal policy, monetary policy, tax policy, labor policy, etc. It cannot just be, exactly, it just cannot be retrenchment in fiscal expenditure. So I disagree that it was really explicitly.
So let me comment on that.
I endorse that view.
One of the things, and me and Mariano have ongoing conversations as well. One of the things that I want to be clear on here all is that the Minister of Finance, in my judgment, did a really good job in the context of cutting expenditure from 63.4 billion down to 50 billion, although it eventually went up to around 52, 53 billion. I cannot ignore that.
How much of that was accumulation of arrears, however?
Some of it, I don't know the exact number.
A significant proportion of it was.
Look at that.
Even so,
exactly. So it was not simply, it was not explicitly a cut in expenditure. If all you've really done is, or say half of what you've done is rack up arrears, that I don't accept that as.
So considerable amount of arrears remain, and the minister could have maintained an expenditure pattern that was out of sync with revenues. We saw previous government do it in the past. He could have. My point is he chose a different pathway, and I, in my view, as an economist, I can't deny him whatever kudos comes his way, however little, in that relation. What I would say is that the error was in not understanding the economics fully of what he did. So y is equal to c plus I plus g plus x minus m. He focused heavily on the G part of income determination, brought it down, but in so doing did not understand or misunderstood or was improperly advised that if you stir the x minus m part sufficiently, you could preserve some aspects of y. Instead, we have seen about a 9% contraction in real GDP since 2015. And some of that, I am saying, could have been avoided by balancing the internal devaluation, which is the term I use, with an appropriate foreign sector policy or export-oriented strategy.
I agree with you. And there's one more thing related to the balance of payments that I wanted to highlight, simply because to me, it is so obscene. And it is something that I, from a policy and solutions perspective, struggling with it. If you look at the data of the errors and omissions item of the balance of payments, we lost $5.15 billion in errors and omissions in the last 3 years. If you say in 2016, 17, and 18. I'm not counting 19. We don't have the data yet. So in 3 years, 16 to 18, we lost $5.15 billion in errors and omissions, which is basically outflows that we cannot account for. The largest outflow was in 2013 of about 4.6. The net errors and omissions item was negative $4.6 billion of an outflow that we cannot account for. Then you have 2.7 in 2014, 2.9 in 2015, about 900 million in 2016, 1.6 billion in 2017, and 2.6 billion in 2018. Where is that money going? How do we account for it? How do we fix that? What is happening? And this has nothing to do with fiscal policy. This, to me, gentlemen, has to do with corruption. in my own view, yes, the amount of Venezuelans that come and pull money or used to pull US dollars out of the ATMs might have something to do with it. But we have a huge informal sector. We have a lot of informality with respect to foreign exchange conversion in Trinidad and Tobago. We have a black market. And we have clearly a lot of foreign currency that flows in officially, that flows out unofficially, which is why we have a huge net errors and omissions item. I would like to hear from you guys what your thoughts are on this and how do you fix this?
Well, I mean, to start off, as long as you have differences in between the official and the unofficial rate, you're going to have that, right? Literally, it begs the question. And there was an interesting development this month, which has been featured when the Republic Bank announced that they're going to cut the limits, the US dollar spending limits
On the
on their
credit cards.
cards,
Yeah.
on the credit cards. Now, most people have missed the point that sometimes when you travel and you use your card, and some of the bigger stores, for example, give you the option in paying in TT dollars. Most people could use and would use the option of paying in TT dollars, but they've never really looked at the exchange rate. And the exchange rate has generally been 750 something.
Yeah.
Right now, I am informed that the banks, in addition to cutting limits, have also changed the rates. All right, that's my information.
That's not a Visa and MasterCard rate that they have determined based on the official exchange rate plus their commissions and fees and so?
Well, I wouldn't know whether it's a Visa rate. I would know the rate at which my US dollar transaction has been converted to TT dollars. I don't know if Visa is automatically charging Republic Bank and or Royal Bank at 750. I don't know. I suspect not. I suspect not. All right, but I don't think that is so. As far as they're concerned, they bill you dollars, you pay for it. Right. The fact that some other firms have been making a decision means that they have a strong foreign currency trading position and they know what the market is and they are making those decisions. But if my information is correct and the banks are doing that on the other side, the banks are taking a direct step with regard to repricing US dollars at the rate at which they sell US dollars for what we would consider to be the purchases window. All right. Now, that in itself would be an interesting feature. Now, I have to get to that. But as far as I understand, from those who have looked up, for example, the conversion rate for the US bill to TT dollars, that is what my feedback is. I haven't gotten my bill for the month yet, so I haven't been able to check it. All right. But as soon as I check it, I will confirm. That in itself would say a lot with regard to what the banks are doing with regard to selling US dollars. And I think we'll be able to tell from the next reporting cycle, next quarterly reporting cycle in terms of results, what would the foreign exchange earnings look like for the banks? If there's an increase, then you know that has nothing to do with Visa. Right? That will have to do with a direct transfer to the bottom line on the other side of the fence. Now, we cannot continue this disparity between the official number at which the banks are meant to convert at and the unofficial number. And if what I understand that the banks have done with regard to the credit card side, it means that they would have taken matters into their own hands. All right. So
yeah, because there's a market for it at a higher rate.
Precisely. Precisely. Right. So that in a sense may affect it. I don't know, but clearly you have to you can't run a situation where we have two parallel rates because all that encourages is a black market. With the best will in the world, that is what is going to take place.
We have a black market. We've had it for several years.
Well, I'm not disputing that. I'm not disputing that. I'm just saying that is part of the issue. Now, there are other issues included in that number, which is not only explained. Well, it could say everything is a black market, but clearly the black market, there are segments in what we consider to be legal as distinct from illegal activity. So there are other issues in that regard. And quite apart from the fact that our data collection also needs to be improved.
Of course,
right?
but Mariano, in fairness, we had a much smaller errors and omissions item before 2013. So it doesn't suggest to me that there was a sudden deterioration in our data collections capability. It suggested to me that something changed significantly.
But the methodology also changed in terms of recording balance of payments information. For example, I no longer look at FDI data for Trinidad and Tobago, the inflows and the outflows. I feel the numbers to me now, this is a personal view. The numbers to me don't add up, and I have to understand the change in the methodology some more before I feel comfortable to use the FDI information. So in my case, I haven't invested enough time to understand it properly enough. But when I see the numbers and I see net FDI always constantly, if I recall, negative, the numbers, it leaves me a little troubled. Now, this is my personal view, Marla. Others may understand it, but I am worried by the numbers when I see them.
But that's capital flight, Roger. What is so shocking to you about capital flight in the last 8 years?
Marla, the FDI numbers now reflect outflows.
With net errors and omission.
Well, sorry, Roger. Kevin, yes, this is exactly what Roger is saying. He's saying he doesn't have faith in the net FDI numbers because he's been seeing a negative number, which suggests a net outflow. And all I am saying is that I do not find that wholly unbelievable simply because it suggests to me that there has been capital flight. And if you talk to business people and you talk to people who hold capital, that's exactly what has been happening.
But that's something different, Marla. I think the net errors.
Why is that something different?
No, the net errors and omission, I think, will capture your capital flight,
Nope.
No. So let me explain why I say that.
Roger, if it left via the banking system, it would have showed up in the balance of payment.
No, it is not leaving via the banking system. So here's what I think.
That's why it's not showing up.
The hardwares will put up a sign, US buying at $7.50 and $8 TT for one. They collect this money, they do not declare it, and they take this money and carry it abroad. And the bank has no. So you remember earlier you mentioned.
And they carry it in their suitcase, right?
And however, but you remember you mentioned earlier, money comes in formally.
And leaves informally.
I think that some of that is what is happening there. But in terms of the net FDI is simply the difference between FDI inflows and FDI outflows, some of which could be reason goes to other Caribbean islands and whatnot. It's a personal comment. I'm saying I am not comfortable with the numbers I have seen. I understand the methodology has changed. I have to invest some time to understand the change in the methodology, but I have stayed far away from the FDI data for a while for that reason.
Kevin, you wanted to add something to that.
Well, just, I don't want us to spend too much time on this FDI and this balance of payment outflow thing, but just my investigation is that I used to track petroleum FDI very closely. And like Roger, I have stopped quoting those numbers publicly because I don't fully understand the new methodology that the CSO and the central bank have been using. And the numbers have turned from positive to negative, which suggests money leaving. What I was told, I asked the central bank for an explanation as to what is this new methodology, and I was told that it reflects now the inflow from, and this is petroleum FDI.
So whenever you look at the oil and gas sector is what you're saying.
Whenever you look at the FDI Excel spreadsheet on the central bank website, the first line is petroleum FDI. That is reflecting now inflows and outflows. And by outflows, we mean what would be the outflows? The outflows would be payments of dividends and so on. So and according to the new standard, it gives a better idea of the investment flows in a sector. So it's not just the inflows, but the inflows and the outflows. So, but like Roger, I wouldn't want to, go down that road until I completely understand what are the mechanics behind that.
Well, I would say, have you noticed that there has been quite a bit of outward investment by some of the larger conglomerates as well as non-conglomerates?
That too, yeah.
As Roger had suggested, in the region as well as outside of the region. So not just dividends in terms of reaping your returns to your investment or repatriating dividends, but also capital investment. And when I have had these conversations with some of the larger and smaller businesses too in Trinidad and Tobago, what they say is the cost of doing business in Trinidad is too high. As Roger had pointed out, the ease of doing business has only become more difficult. The cost of security in Trinidad, the IDB released a report a year or two ago around how crime has affected the ease of doing business and the cost of doing business. And also the uncertainty with respect to the policy stance, where you have the administrations, you have one government in for one term, and then you switch to another government, and so the amount of, I guess, uncertainty related to policy continuity also affects the business decisions. And I can't say that I disagree with any of those views. You have people who are not sure what the foreign exchange rate is going to be, what the policy stance with respect to foreign exchange is going to be. And so they prefer to have their FX outside of Trinidad and Tobago and their investments more so outside of Trinidad and Tobago, so that they can hedge against that level of uncertainty and decline. And Roger, you spoke about the decline in non-energy exports, which is partly as a result of an overvalued currency, but is also partly as a result of people not investing in upgrading and enhancing machinery and equipment and promoting greater efficiency and growth in their production domestically. You have manufacturers that have complained about not being able to source foreign exchange to buy the inputs to manufacture their products as well. So all of this one policy with respect to the foreign exchange rate in terms of supply and in terms of price has had significant ramifications. And I would argue that the FDI is one of them as well.
Well, there's no disputing that, Marla. I mean, that's true what you have said. In this tight macroeconomic situation, each variable is affected one by the other. So the crime, for example, is driving a lot of things. The homicide rate in Trinidad and Tobago, we have murdered 1% of the labor force since 2005. And
wow.
That's driving a significant amount of decision making. So the cost of doing business is going up, as you mentioned. I think that will also be linked to your net errors and omissions, because I find your point interesting. I'm trying to reason it in my head. I think it would stir capital flight for sure, and some of the capital flight would be through official channels in terms of outward investment, but some would be through unofficial channels which you cannot record, and therefore it finds its way into net errors and omissions. So all of those things are very related in my view, and it brings us to one common point: a very badly managed economy, a fragile economy, as I like to say, and an economy that by 2024, if you look at the growth rate of the Trinidad and Tobago economy using IMF numbers from 2008 to 2024, you would see that Trinidad and Tobago in that time period would have grown on average 1.1%, Barbados 1.9%, whereas places like Grenada 45.6%, St. Kitts and Nevis 43.9%, Suriname 32.1%, St. Vincent and
Guyana,
the
90%.
No, I took Guyana out because Guyana is over 400%.
Wow.
So we are in an extremely fragile state, and I'm talking about the data from 2020 to 2024 did not include the closure of Petrotrin, and still we have overall 1.1%. So I don't want, sometimes when I hear some of these government ministers use numbers, I wonder if they are making up these numbers. Where do these numbers come from? Because they are in direct contradiction to what I consider to be the benchmark institution, the IMF.
Yes.
I can see clearly now.
Yes. Well, we need to wrap up because we're drawing close to an hour, and I don't want to keep you all too much. So you can hit me with your closing remarks. Let's do it in reverse this time. We'll end with Mariano. Kevin, let's start with you. Tell us what remaining thoughts you have and your outlook.
I think 2020 natural gas production is going to fall, and we know that natural gas production is the major determinant of economic growth in Trinidad. We've had three consecutive years of economic contraction. I see no evidence that we would have economic growth in 2019. I think the IMF and Moody's both agree with me. And I see a continuation of that contractive type environment into 2020. I don't see any relief for the energy sector production-wise until 2022, when projects like the Ruby project and the BP Matapal project and the Cassia Sea compression project come into production. So I think we are in for a difficult 2020 from an energy sector perspective, and that's both production and price, and a difficult 2021. So we are in a what I call a banya belly scenario.
I hear you, and I agree. I agree with your view. And in addition to the fact that Suriname and Guyana have been making huge discoveries recently, Guyana saw first oil about a month ago. You know, I think Trinidad could no longer count itself to be the you know, front runner in terms of energy in this region, and probably forever.
Well, we may see a fundamental change in the entire Southern Caribbean in the next 10 years with the emergence of Suriname and Guyana and Jamaica to our north.
Right. Good. Thanks, Roger. Your final thoughts.
So, I would take off from where Kevin left off. So there's a 98% correlation between real GDP and natural gas production in Trinidad and Tobago. So if it is the natural gas production in 2019, I looked at the numbers up until last night, are different from what was quoted in the budget speech 2020. I think in the budget speech 2020, 3.8 MMCF, Kevin, or BSCF were quoted per day.
Billion cubic feet.
Right, 3.8 billion cubic feet was quoted per day, and we are now at around 3.6. And if it is revenues was forecasted on that 3.8, then we are going to expect an even greater deficit on that basis. And what I would close in saying is that we need to think seriously about the future of this economy. Unless we get non-energy exports up to a level probably 4 times what it currently is, this economy will remain very fragile, very broken, and characterized by persistent fiscal deficits, and current account imbalances will emerge. And so the onus is up to the governance process and the governance structure and the people in charge of governance to go after the low-hanging fruits, which I would emphasize at this point. The chief of them I would identify as the ease of doing business. Pull together the relevant line ministers, let the Prime Minister lead a team, set KPIs, and within 6 months to 1 year, try to turn around the Trinidad and Tobago economy. The party is at an end, and it's time to fix the economy.
Roger, I agree completely with you that we need to focus on exports, but I would say it's more than just the ease of doing business in terms of driving non-energy exports.
I picked a low-hanging fruit for them.
But what could be lower hanging than not having an overvalued currency? We can fix that in very short order. You don't need a team of ministers to fix that and KPIs to fix that, Roger.
I hear you. I stayed clear of that in this particular year.
Why?
So I mean, they are not going to attend to it. I can't see. If he didn't fix it in 2015, I mean, they made some token gesture, moved it from 6.3 to 6.7. They are not going to attend to that this year because there is the myth. There is a myth that fixing that would cause you to lose the election and will make things difficult. Look at the economy after 1993. In fact, this economy had a golden era of growth after the then PNM government floated the currency in 1993, of which Mariano was probably a part.
And I would also remind you that up until 2012, we had an auction element in the injection system. And the first budget speech that this administration made, the Minister of Finance mentioned that that auction system will be reintroduced. I think he also mentioned it in his second budget speech. It has never been reintroduced. And it worked well. It allowed for slow and steady depreciation of the currency that was not linked to any price instability. Nobody noticed that the exchange rate was moving. To me, it worked beautifully. I'm not sure what the reason was behind disbanding it, but all I'm saying, Roger, in addressing an overvalued currency, I am not, and by no means suggesting we need to devalue the currency to 8 to 1 overnight. We have a mechanism that we used to have that worked, and perhaps all we need to do is reintroduce that, as this government had said they would do. But I agree with you, we need to focus on ease of doing business. We need to focus on the exchange rate and investment to get exports up. And I agree with you wholeheartedly that that's what we really need to focus
on. And Marla, one last point, please. If we could bring the murder level down from over 500 to whatever is considered sensible, domestic investment can increase.
Of course.
So we will woo and fawn upon foreign direct investment, but the domestic investors, certainly a lot of people are afraid to invest in this type of climate. So we are shooting ourselves in our own feet.
Indeed, I agree. Now, that's one I'm not sure how to fix, but Mariano, your final thoughts, please.
Well, I mean, what is there left for me to say?
How to fix the crime, Mariano?
Quite frankly, I can't disagree. And what I have said publicly is that I expect the economy to continue declining with some flattening towards 2022. And dependent upon the decisions that were made by BHP, you may see some uptick, but that is only likely to take place between 2025 and 2026. So in real terms, you're going to have, as Roger has pointed out, a continuous decline. And my position is, and you see, I think we've left things for so long that unfortunately, the floating exchange rate has been hijacked. So that the next adjustment is going to be a devaluation. I don't think we can get away from that.
I think so.
Yes.
Yeah.
But you can't. I mean, we're talking about the difference between 680 and 775, 750, right? So you're talking about a significant adjustment in a one-off. And if you were to do the option today, that's exactly what would take place. But that's what happened in Jamaica in 1990.
And in Suriname in 13 or 12.
Yeah.
The thing is, if you have a devaluation in the absence of an ease of doing business improvement and an investment improvement, then all you're going to do is reprice everything at a higher level.
Yes.
And I'm not, and don't get me wrong. I'm simply saying, I take your point that it is one thing that you have to do as a beginning, but it has to be done in conjunction with a whole other series of policies that have to be put into position. I take that perspective, right? But as an immediate step to get people's attention, to get focus, to get direction, and to demonstrate that you really are serious about turning things around, that will have to be the ultimate, but first step in my mind. And I think, unfortunately, given what we have done without really setting out priorities and focusing on the key measures that we want to adjust, we have found ourselves with very little room for maneuver. So that I don't see too many options over the course of the next 18 months. I share Roger's view that the current administration, if they were afraid for 5 years, they're not likely to get brave in the last 6 months.
No.
Right? So nothing is going to happen. Now, the real issue is the next administration, will they get brave in the first 6 months? That's the key question.
My own view on that is that I feel like the only time I have seen any government in this region, please tell me if your view is different, making significant reforms that require tremendous political will and leadership. And it is hardly ever the case that it happens in the absence of an IMF program. Very, very, very rare. So
there you have it.
There you have it. Gentlemen.
I leave it to that note.
Yes, exactly. I cannot thank you enough, gentlemen. I really appreciate having this kind of a discussion with you to start off our 2020. I hope our audience also appreciates this type of discussion and would help give them some perspective going into this year and into the years beyond 2020. I appreciate your time and your effort. And you know, when the time comes for us to embark on significant reforms in Trinidad and Tobago, we need to have more of these types of discussions to help people understand why and what the implications are. And I look forward to having more of these types of discussions with you all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.